Hey guys, welcome. And today we're going to talk about, now we're getting now into the late 18 teens and into the 1820s, and we're going to take a look at the presidency of James Monroe. And we're going to see how did American nationalism continue under James Monroe into this time period known as the era of good feelings. And just to recap from what we talked about last discussion, was the War of 1812 really promoted this American patriotism, American nationalism to stand up to that of Great Britain and France and other worldly powers. So Americans are feeling good about themselves for the first time, and they feel like they're ready to boast themselves on a national scale. So very similar to the presidencies of James Madison, James Monroe was overwhelmingly going to be elected the president in 1816 and 1820. If we look at the maps here, we can see the sheer dominance continuing for the Democratic Republican Party. And Monroe's presidency is going to be characterized by the era of good feelings, this time period of boom economically, this time period of patriotism and nationalism, and this time period for expansion. We can see here in this political cartoon, this idea of nationalism and good feelings is kind of characterized as by saying that we Americans were proud, and we're proud that we stood up against the British for a second time and that we've been respected by Europe for the first time. And that's going to be the key thing, is that the Americans feel like they are on par, they are just as important on a global scale as France, Europe, and the rest of France and England and the rest of Europe. And all of the different sections that we talked about with sectionalism kind of coming through with the North and South and now the West, are going to start cooperating. We're going to talk about this American system that is meant to be put forth, an economic plan by Henry Clay to try to tie together the different regions of the country as far as North, South, and West. We're even going to be able to see this sense of nationalism coming through in American literature, as far as sometimes we see when we read texts from in the medieval times or even in the pre-colonial times that words look a little different. Certain words are spelled with an OU, or they're pronounced differently, and we wonder, why has that changed? Well, it's going to change during this era of good feelings with this nationalism sense coming through when Noah Webster writes the American language book, kind of showing the differences between that of the English language in England versus the English language in America. And we can see some examples here on the right side where we have jail is now being spelled differently. The word theater is going to be changed. And then words on, like I said, the OU dropping the U, so honor, color, valor. We can see how all of these different examples have lost their English sense and really creating more of an American English language. Certain even American authors like Washington Irving are going to be created as kind of these American themes, as far as Nathaniel Hawthorne with the Scarlet Letter that you guys read in English class, or the James Cooper books about the West against the Native Americans, kind of as cowboy versus American Indian fights and wars. So we have a true sense of what American literature is rather than the English literature. So this true backing away, or this breaking away from English culture now, creating a true American culture for the first time. So James Monroe is going to really somewhat change the goals of the Democratic Republican Party. If we look at his predecessors before him, we've mentioned that with Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe, their goals were more to limit the scope of the national government and really kind of promote states' rights. However, James Monroe is not focused on that. Now that the War of 1812 is over, he's more on trying to promote national unity, to not allow sectionalism to become a thing that George Washington had warned us about, to kind of create a unifying tie between the North, South, and West, and also to kind of put us on a national stage across the world, so people kind of see America as a dominant power, or as at least a growing power in the world that needs to be respected. And because of the failures of the Federalist Party during the War of 1812, how they were very anti-war, and they even threatened to secede under that Hartford Convention, they are not going to be popular amongst the American people. And it sets up a point where the Democratic Republicans can almost do anything and get away with it because people support them entirely, even the North, over the Federalist Party. So James Monroe and the Democratic Republicans in Congress are going to try to promote nationalism in a few different ways. And the first one they're going to be is to increase the power of national government. This is where we can see a change or an evolving method of the Democratic Republicans. We've been learning about how versus the Federalists, they were for states' rights and they were not for the growing nature of and power of the national government. However, now that Monroe is in power, they're going to try to increase the size of the national government, the power of the national government, especially over the states, and that's going to be used exclusively by John Marshall, who was a Supreme Court justice there. We've talked about him before during Jefferson's presidency, and he has a number of court cases during this era of good feelings that shows the power of the national government over the states' governments. And the first one being Fletcher versus Peck, and this is a court case where a law case in Georgia over claims of land against the Native Americans and against United States citizens, where the court came in and ruled that the state could not deem something unconstitutional, or I'm sorry, that a state law could be unconstitutional. So much different than the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that we mentioned during the Alien Sedition Acts, where a state ruled the federal government unconstitutional. This is the reverse of that, where the federal government is saying, no, 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 Georgia, you cannot create laws that are not constitutional. You have to abide by the federal law. The second case, the Cohens versus Virginia, is going to be the first time that the courts overturn a state decision where they believe that they were in power of the Virginia, and they actually reverse a decision that was made by the Virginia courts. And lastly, Gibbons versus Ogden is the first time that the courts ruled that federal Congress, not the states, had the power to regulate interstate trade. So trade that might be between Virginia and Maryland was no longer going to be regulated by Virginia and Maryland. They did not get to set the terms of their trade. The federal government was going to set the terms of the trade in between various states. The second thing that Monroe is going to do is really try to encourage industry and really try to support a newfound economy. And this is going to line up mostly with Hamilton's ideas here, but this is a way that Henry Clay is going to try to promote industry and promote the economy and bring together the different regions of the United States. And in this, he's going to do a number of things, and the first being to create a second Bank of the United States, much similar to what we talked about with the Bank of the United States under Hamilton's policies. He also wants to create a tariff to encourage industry and limit British manufactured goods. So again, using these tariffs to promote American industry and to try to encourage businesses to buy American. And lastly, he wants to improve transportation, much how the federal and state governments now control our highways and our traffic safety. He wants to try to promote trade with transportation with newfound roads, new canals across especially Lake Erie, to try to connect the different regions of trade together between north, south, and west. And what this American system is going to allow us to do as a country is really try to connect what all the different regions do well. So if you are in the South, you're creating cotton that was used to be manufactured in the northern factory systems. If you're in the West, you're a farmer who's creating grain who's going to be then sold, or it's going to be used to feed livestock or the people of the rest of the country. And if you're in the North, then you have manufactured jobs that you're creating to increase industry and create finished goods. So all three regions are now kind of connected and tied together, and you can see on the map how the different canals here of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario are connecting states like New York to Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, while then railways or roads are being used to connect the states of the South to the North and the West as well. So before we move on, I do want you guys to take a few minutes and pause this video here when I'm done giving instructions and take a look at this picture of Kentucky Congressman Henry Clay. And I want you to think about this as far as how this portrait shows the American system and what parts of the American system are portrayed here in the painting. So take a few minutes and go ahead and jot that down. We're going to discuss this in class tomorrow as well. But think about how the American system is shown here in the painting. So getting back into what Monroe was trying to do in order to increase nationalism and American unity across the country is he's going to try to create a foreign policy that expanded America's borders and try to increase America's role in the world affairs and try to put us on a global scale with that of the European dominant powers. And what we can see here as the population trends tend to shift is that after the War of 1812, Americans are going to flood into the western part of the country. And by 1840, a third of the population lived in the western territories in the states here. So that's including all the way out from Ohio to Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, and then even some moving out into the territories that are not quite states yet, but are controlled by the United States. And Congress is going to quickly admit 5 new states to the Union. You can see the development here. So now if we're talking about 1820, here's what the United States looks like. We can see here the stretching all the way from Maine to that western border of Illinois, Tennessee, and Mississippi, and Louisiana. And the economic and territorial growth creates a need to settle America's national borders, or create a settlement for the United States to succeed, or at least to be non-threatened by outside forces, whether it be Native Americans or the British. And Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, are going to use foreign policy instead of doing what George Washington tried to promote, which was isolationism. They're going to use this to kind of promote nationalism and expand territorially across the North American continent. By 1818, Canada and the United States are going to agree on the 49th parallel, this line that separates the border here across where the present-day like North and South Dakota are, with that of Canada. We're also going to add Florida into the Union as eventually a state, but as a territory, with the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819. So we're really expanding and promoting this patriotism across the North American continent. One of the things, too, that was such a resounding effect of the American Revolution that we've mentioned before, and I know that we definitely talked about in world history as well, was that the American Revolution inspired revolutions across the board in Central and South America, whether in Mexico or Brazil or in Bolivia, Peru, Colombia. All of these Latin and South American countries are trying to break away from Spain and Portugal. And the Americans want to support them as these new republics and as these new democracies are going to be established. And with that is going to be written in 1823, the Monroe Doctrine. And written by John Quincy Adams and used by President James Madison, the Monroe Doctrine is going to be a way to kind of tell the rest of the world to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. It promises that the United States will not interfere in Europe as long as Europe will not interfere in the West. And it's a way of kind of, you can see in the political cartoon, Uncle Sam is drawing a line in the sand, per se, with the Monroe Doctrine, telling the British and telling the French to stay out of the West, to not interfere with what these newfound countries are doing, and to let these countries try to strive and grow as newfound republics. So the Monroe Doctrine is a clear shift in foreign policy away from the isolationism that George Washington had promoted and had been basically used for the first 4 presidents, and now we're starting to kind of puff out our chests, we'll say, to kind of show that we will not take invasions or threats from European countries. So even though the era of good feelings was this time of nationalism, there will be this growing problem of sectionalism, especially between the North and the South. And if we see here from the map and the demographics here on the map, that slavery is going to be the root cause of that issue. And we can see how the slaves are trending more towards the South and also more towards the western part of the country. So even though Northern and Southerners typically disagreed over taxes and the scope of the federal government, slavery is going to dominate politics for the next 40 years, and that will be a precursor to the American Civil War. So when Missouri applies to become a state, this is really going to create a disagreement or a divide between the northern and southern states, because the northerners do not want to be overrun in the federal government by the southern states. They do not want the southern states to have an increased amount of power in the national government, because the fear is that slavery will be entitled forever. So if the Missouri would be entered as a slave state, the South would have 2 more senators than the North, and that's vital when it comes to voting on legislation. So in 1820, again, Henry Clay comes in as the great compromiser and is going to negotiate the Missouri Compromise, or the Compromise of 1820. Make sure you know the terms could be used for either. And what this is basically going to say is that Missouri will become a slave state, while Maine becomes a free state and breaks away from Massachusetts. So now that there will be an equal number of free and slave states. And that slavery was to be outlawed in all western territories above the latitude 3630 on the map. So anything above the Arkansas Territory, except for Missouri, will now be no longer, it will be a free territory rather than a slave territory. So as a way to kind of wrap up this trio of Democratic Republican presidents, we're going to assess and give achievements and failures to these three presidents. So be sure you're ready to do that and discuss that in class. And again, if you have any questions about the Monroe presidency or the era of good feelings, please have them ready for yourselves when you come to class, and I will see you tomorrow.